Years ago this month that I published my first journal paper on the links between logistics and climate change. And it was 8 years ago this month that my book on the decarbonisation of logistics was published. So these are milestones, if you like. My time is limited. The full version of this presentation takes 50 minutes, okay? So I'm going to try and compress this into 15 minutes. The purpose really is to encourage academics working on the logistical aspects of climate change to extend their research horizons. Because I'm arguing that logistics has a fundamental role to play in the way that we deal with the climate crisis. It says here, the role of logistics. In fact, it's several roles. I reckon there are 8 ways in which logistics is fundamental to the way in which we manage the climate crisis. First of all, logistics is a cause. It's an activity that emits a lot of CO2, but it's decarbonising. Efforts are well underway to cut those emissions. It's a victim. There are very few activities as vulnerable to climate change as logistics, but it's adapting. It's climate-proofing its operations. It's also facilitating the decarbonisation of other sectors. It's a rescuer, because humanitarian logistics is required, obviously, to rescue those people who are the climate victims. It's going to be a remover, because for us to meet our climate change targets, we are going to have to remove vast amounts of greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, and that's got major implications for logistics. And then finally, if everything else fails, if our mitigation efforts and our adaptation and efforts fail, then we may have to resort to what we call geoengineering to preserve life on the planet. But I'll come back to that subject much later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through these 8 roles. So first of all, logistics as a victim. Over the years, I've pulled together as much data as I can to carbon footprint logistics. My best estimate is logistics represents between 11 and 12% of global CO2 emissions. If logistics were a country, it would be the 3rd in the league table behind China and the United States, emitting about 4.2 billion tonnes of CO2 per annum. Most of that coming from the transport operation, but also some of it from the buildings and the freight terminals and the IT aspects. I said it's decarbonising. It's generally accepted that logistics will be a very hard sector to decarbonise for 3 reasons. First of all, because it's almost totally dependent on fossil fuel currently. Secondly, because of the forecast growth in the amount of freight movement over the next few decades. International Transport Forum reckons there'll be a 2.6 times growth in the amount of freight movement by 2050. And the third thing is the assets that we use in logistics have a very long life. There's a very slow replacement cycle to the next generation of low-carbon trucks, ships, locomotives, and so forth. Now, the International Transport Forum, which has the main model we use for freight and emissions, they reckon that if all the current government policies worldwide were implemented, we would still see about a 28% increase in freight transport emissions by 2050. They then constructed what they call their high ambition scenario, applying a lot of very radical measures, which could possibly get that percentage down by about 76%. But that, for example, would require a carbon price of about $500 per tonne of CO2. So how do we decarbonise logistics? Basically 5 things. We can reduce the amount of freight movement. We can shift as much freight to lower carbon transport modes, from air to sea, from road to rail. We can optimise the utilisation of our logistics capacity, fill the vehicles and the aircraft. We can improve the energy efficiency of logistical operations. That's both the freight transport and the warehousing. And then finally, we can transition from fossil fuel to the low-carbon renewable fuels as well. Now, I could spend the next hour just talking about those 5 options. I don't have the time to do that. Moving on to logistics as a victim, this photo mosaic shows you all the ways in which freight transport systems and warehousing are vulnerable to extreme weather. I argued that logistics is one of the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable economic activities, basically for three reasons. Because logistics is so geographically extensive. I mean, the core function of logistics is to move freight over long distances between points of production and consumption. Secondly, because logistical systems are very tightly interconnected. And finally, because logistics is highly time sensitive. We've now had several decades of just-in-time, which means we've got closely coupled processes in logistics, which again adds to vulnerability. What I've done in this slide is try to encapsulate the vulnerability of logistics. So we've got our three weather variables: temperature, precipitation, and wind. We've then got what I call the geophysical impacts of those weather variables affecting flooding, landslides, drought, sea level rise. And then we've got our logistics assets in the middle, which are affected either directly or indirectly by these things. And logistics is also very heavily dependent on other infrastructures, particularly the energy supply and the communication infrastructures. So this makes this activity very vulnerable to extreme weather events. And of course, we know what happens then when we have extreme weather disrupting our supply chains, causing a loss of product and impaired service and so forth. But efforts are being made to climate-proof logistics. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on a 7-year cycle, publishes its assessment of the state of knowledge about climate change. The most recent report was published in 2022. There was one report on adaptation to climate change. It's a big document. It's got 3,068 pages in total, but it makes only 3 very brief references to logistics. It seems to me the IPCC is grossly underestimating the vulnerability of logistics to extreme weather. There has been a lot of research done on the vulnerability of transport infrastructure, big literature on that subject, and some of the results of that are rather concerning. There was a study, much quoted study in 2016, which tried to work out how much material we would have to move to climate-proof 200 of the world's ports. And you can see some of the figures there. 360 million cubic meters of concrete would be required, 50 million tons of cement, just to give these ports protection against about a 2 meter rise in the level of the sea. My next role is that of logistics as a facilitator. This is a sort of cross-sectoral view, because to decarbonize other sectors, we have to move and store vast amounts of material. Good example of that is the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. We have to put in place a renewable energy infrastructure. That process is well underway, moving wind turbines and solar panels, and that device is an electrolyzer, which will make green hydrogen. But this is a material and transport intensive process. And one reason for its transport intensity is because renewable energy infrastructure is highly decentralized. Here's some data for Germany. 2021, there were 13 oil refineries, 100 natural gas plants, which generated 32 gigawatts, billion watts of power. To get that same amount of energy from wind turbines, you would need 16,400 wind turbines. So you get a sense of the logistical challenge we have in putting in place this highly dispersed energy generating process. The other thing is that the global supply chains that supply the components for wind turbines and for solar panels and batteries for e-vehicles, these are all very transport intensive supply chains, and much of the stuff is what we call out of gauge. It doesn't fit easily on ships or trucks or containers. So gives you a sense of the challenge. But we can also see logistics helping other sectors to adapt to climate change, particularly providing flood protection, for example. So it's estimated there's going to be about 11% growth per annum in the amount of flood protection required. And then population resettlement. latest estimates suggest there are 267 million people in the world who live within 2 meters of sea level. The IPCC estimates there are about 1 billion people in the world that are currently exposed to the risk of sea level rise. So we will require a massive construction logistics exercise to rehouse these people in locations that are less climate vulnerable. My next role is one very familiar to people in the room. Humanitarian logistics is a large and vibrant field of academic research. We've just had a training program here in Ho Chi Minh City on this subject. But if one looks at recent research by the International Federation of the Red Cross, they reckon that in 2018 there were 108 million people in the world who required humanitarian aid because of extreme weather, because of floods, storms, droughts and wildfires. They've also projected forward and reckon that by 2050, probably at least twice that number of people will require support because they're living in climate-stressed communities. We've also got to consider migration, because all the projections are that as climate change worsens, more and more people will have to move home. The UNHCR estimated in 2019 that about 25 million people in the world had to be relocated as a result of climate events, and some projections suggest that up to 1 billion people may have to be moved as a result of climate by 2050. Then I get into some more controversial areas. So if I get to my seventh role for logistics, which is that of a remover. This is the side of net zero, which is very seldom discussed. But this is my definition of net zero. It's where we reduce our emissions as much as possible by mitigation, but we then have to balance any surplus emissions by removing greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere, a process that we call carbon sequestration. Today, about 92% of the global economy is covered by net zero pledges of governments and of companies. So net zero is fundamental, but how much greenhouse gas would we then have to remove from the atmosphere? So the latest IPCC projection is that by between 2020 and 2100, we may have to remove about 665 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. That's 18 times as much CO2 that energy use put into the atmosphere in 2018. It would be about 6 to 10 billion tons of CO2 per annum we would have to remove from the atmosphere. Now, there are many climate scientists who are very doubtful that we will have the ability or the money to conduct carbon sequestration at that scale. If you look at some of the literature, they talk about pipe dreams and fairy tales and traps. So this is why this is a very controversial subject. If we do it, there are basically two ways we can remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. The first is using a process called BECCS, Bioenergy Carbon Capture and Storage, where we would grow more vegetation. We would then cut it down, we would burn it, we would get the energy, but we would capture the CO2 and bury it permanently underground. Problem with that, though, is that some of the modelling suggests that if you look at the BECCS supply chain, from the planting of the trees to the burial of the CO2 underground, that would actually emit more CO2 than you would actually capture. So if that's the case, what's the point of doing it? Second process is something we call direct air capture, where you use mechanical and chemical processes to get the CO2 out of the atmosphere using devices we call carbon scrubbers. Problem with that, however, is that the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere are very low. CO2 is only 0.04% of the air. So we therefore have to filter a vast amount of air to capture the CO2. In fact, you have to filter 1,600 tons of atmosphere to get 1 ton of CO2. That is going to be a very energy-intensive process. And the technologies to do this are very immature currently. So International Energy Agency estimates in 2023, we managed only to get about 10,000 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere using this process. By 2050, we will have to get between 6 and 10 billion tons. And many people are doubtful about our ability to do this. But if we do it, the main thing is it's going to require a lot of logistics. So a study done for the European Commission reckons that by 2050, we may need between 11 and 17,000 kilometers of pipeline in Europe to move the captured CO2 from locations within the continent, mainly to the North Sea, where it will be buried underground. And, last year, we saw the launch of the very first purpose-designed CO2 carrier, which will then be used to move captured CO2 to locations where it can be stored. And then finally, my 8th option, where we get into the realms of science fiction, this is geoengineering. Now, it used to be there were 2 aspects of geoengineering. One was carbon dioxide removal, and then the other was what we call solar radiation management, where we screen the planet from sunlight. And it used to be they were both considered extreme options that would probably never be required. Well, carbon dioxide removal has now become mainstream. It's factored into all the climate models. But the second one, carbon dioxide or solar radiation management, is still considered by many to be a rather extreme option. Some people call this turning down the sunlight. And the way you would do that would be mainly by putting sulfates into the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere. Now again, this would have to be done at a planetary scale, and again would impose a huge burden on logistics. There's a professor at a university in California has worked out that if we were able to disperse about 3 million tons of sulfates in the upper atmosphere, that would cancel out about a 0.3 degrees centigrade temperature rise on the ground. Now, you might think that's easy, because every year we put about 60 million tons of air cargo into the atmosphere. So we're good at it. But the trouble is the air cargo doesn't fly high enough. So the process we're talking about here is stratospheric aerosol injection. You would require these aircraft to fly at about 20 kilometers, and currently there are no commercial aircraft that do that. But recent research has suggested that it really wouldn't be too difficult for us to design and build aircraft like this one, what they call a sail, a stratospheric aerosol injection lofter that would lift the sulfate into the atmosphere. But it would require an enormous human effort to achieve that. And if we were to do it, we would then be condemning future generations to continue to do this. Because if ever that process stopped, then we would have runaway climate change with all the catastrophic effects that would have. So just to end, as I said, the purpose of the work I've been doing, there's a journal paper in the pipeline on this subject, is to try to waken up the academic research community to some of these other research options in the field. One thing that really interests me is the interconnection between these 8 roles, because many of those roles will generate a lot more freight movement, which is then going to make it harder for us to decarbonize logistical activities. And also, I haven't had time to go into that, if you do a logistical analysis of some of these options, you discover they're probably not feasible in the first place. But the other thing, because much of what I've been saying has been negative, let's end on a positive note, okay? It seems to me there are going to be huge business opportunities here for logistics companies, for companies that can now maybe diversify into adaptation or to carbon dioxide removal. And I don't think there are many logistics companies as yet which have wakened up to the potential climate opportunities that can confront them. Anyway, there are my contact details. Again, you can all have copies of this presentation. If you're interested, do contact me. There's my book. I've just done a report for the World Bank on how we decarbonize logistics in the less developed countries. And then there's a report coming out in a month's time about how we decarbonize logistics in Southeast Asia and also in Central Asia. So it's been very rushed. I apologize for that. I hope you found it of interest, and thank you.
Professor McKinnon. sorry also for.
And also resources.
Yes.
We are organizing the sense of the companies in Vietnam are in SMEs. Just want to get thank you.
A great question. It will take me at least 2 hours to answer, probably. I'm not trying to customize this to individual countries. Um, Clearly, the importance of the 8 roles is going to vary from country to country. So I was in Bangladesh recently, which I think is the 5th most climate-exposed country in the world, where they've got severe risk of flooding and so forth. But they emit very little CO2 per capita. So their emphasis should be much more on adaptation than on decarbonisation. One thing about Vietnam is your economy is growing so rapidly, and the growth of freight traffic is very rapid. And also the amount of external freight that you send through global supply chain is increasing very rapidly. So, I mean, the hope would be that despite that rapid freight traffic growth, you're still able to decarbonise it. And again, when I was preparing the last report there, one thing that did encourage me is that the energy transition here in Vietnam is progressing quite rapidly, right? Moving to lower carbon energy sources. What I don't know, and the experts in the room, is the extent to which Vietnam is going to be exposed to sea level rise, for example. I mean, you have low-lying land on the southern part around the Mekong Delta. So I suspect a lot of your future investment will go into climate proofing a lot of your freight transport infrastructure as well. So yeah, but that's the next stage of the research, to see what I've said related to specific regions and specific countries. So thank you for your questions. Great.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And we time for our second question. And then we talk through.
Sure.
Is there a second question? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Oh, sure. Yes. Thanks very much for the presentation. It's the second time now I've seen it, and it gets more interesting every time. But I wanted to ask specifically about so talking about the different decarbon, also the taking carbon out and carbon capture, and so you see a lot of the larger energy companies are investing in this, and I'm curious what your opinion is on how effective it will be when balancing maybe motivations or of companies who have made so much money in oil and now they're shifting. What is your opinion on really how effective that would be?
Again, an excellent question. One thing that's very worrying is that the big oil companies are now investing in carbon capture and storage. And why are they doing that? Because if that technology were shown to work and can be done at scale, it would allow them to continue exploiting oil and route it. Aramco, for example, has spent billions of dollars trying to put carbon capture and storage facilities on the back of trucks, because they said we should continue to supply those trucks with diesel fuel. That would be a misuse of carbon sequestration. Clearly, we don't want that to happen. But again, I engage with quite a few academics and companies that are working on this. They're all hoping for a breakthrough in the technology, but it hasn't happened as yet. I work closely with a professor at Cambridge University. He's done basically a back-of-the-envelope calculation to show how hard this will be. I mentioned how much air we have to filter to get 1 ton of CO2. So he worked out that to recover 5% of the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere in 2022, we would need 78,000 of the most powerful jet engines on the planet working 24/7 for a whole year to recapture that. And of course, all that energy would have to be zero carbon renewable energy. So it gives you a sense. This takes us beyond logistics. This isn't mechanics, and that assumes that the chemical processes can work that quickly. So you can understand why many people are doubtful about this happening, which means we should be putting greater emphasis on mitigation, on cutting emissions today, rather than relying on some technological breakthrough. So,
Thank you.
Well, thanks for the presentation. I have a main question. 70% of Earth is water, and 10 to 15% will be the deserts and mountains where we cannot plant it. So the balance 10 to close to 20% only we can plant trees and get carbon absorbed. And I understand in the sea there are seaweed which absorb carbon dioxide. Why can't we just there is any project on planting trees, big trees, algae in the sea so that it will get a big carbon functions as a carbon sink and absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide, which is a natural process so that technologically we need not invent or do or spend much of money, but the research is going on. What stage we are on that? Thank you.
Okay, so there are many ways of getting CO2 out of the atmosphere. I mentioned two of them. Another one is the one you mentioned, where you use algae in the ocean. You fertilize the algae with iron sulfates, and it increases the amount of CO2 it captures from the atmosphere. But I mean, this gets us into the realms of scientific research. Recent work on that suggests that you would have to disperse a vast amount of industry of iron sulfate, which would have a damaging effect to maritime ecosystems, right? And at the end of the day, it might not actually increase the amount of CO2 that gets captured. I mean, another thing we could do is just cover the world with trees. We could plant a lot more vegetation and use nature-based systems to get the CO2. But the problem there is we just don't have enough land, we don't have enough water, and also forests are very vulnerable to extreme weather. I mean, 2 years ago we had a serious storm in Scotland that knocked over 1 million trees in one night. I mean, last year we had wildfires covering Canada, so we just cannot rely on vegetation alone to do this process. I'm happy to discuss this with you over coffee as well, because these are mega subjects that we